Just to let you know, at the Pentagon, this is the scene right now where the president is meeting with his national security team and also those at the Pentagon and sort of want an update on his ISIS strategy. But when you think of that national security team, I keep forgetting how big it is and how many sit on. Obviously, besides the president, vice president, and the secretary of state, includes the secretary of treasury, secretary of defense, the attorney general, and it goes on to include all of their respective deputies, the head of the U.S. Central Command, the commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command. Now, some in the military in particular have been very critical of this strategy without questioning their commander-in-chief outright, saying that he has not really given them a consistent or reliable plan as to how to deal with ISIS since these latest terror attacks, not only the ones in Paris, but of course in California. John Hanna is joining us right now, former National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. John, good to have you. I see this trip, and you know better than I, as a sort of a hand-holding effort on the part of the president to remind the Pentagon, I'm on top of this. Let's all speak from the same page on this. Am I misinterpreting it?
No, I think you're probably right on target, Neil. I've got always high hopes for the president, but very low expectations. I think this is really about political theater, as you say, going to be long on optics, messaging, and performance, but I think pretty short on strategy. It's in essence kind of a do-over from a week ago in the Oval Office, where he really didn't get the job done reassuring the American people that he's up to the challenge of defeating ISIS.
Well, my dad used to tell me that if you have to keep explaining bad grades, then either you're lying or you're stupid. So I'll leave my own grades out of it for the time being, but if he failed to make that connection and reassure Americans with that address 8 days ago, what could he possibly say or do now with a backdrop of the Pentagon?
Yeah, my guess, like I say, I think just changing the medium, that is, not having him alone in the Oval Office where it was a dismal failure, but putting him in the seat of American military power, saying that more or less the same thing, but with a bit more conviction, and surrounding him with his top generals and national security advisors. They're hoping this time it'll be the charm.
Now, you know better this process. When you disagree with either your chief, there was very little acrimony, disagreement, maybe on the latter stages of the Iraq War with President Bush and the vice president. You could speak to that far better than I. But how do you convey, or how do military types convey to a president or the White House, look, we think this strategy isn't working, or we think that this might be a better strategy? Because it seems odd to me, whether you're listening to, Ash Carter or the FBI director, they've both raised serious concerns about our safety, as if reaching out to the public and then trying to get to the president, hey, this is big.
Yeah, no, I think it's these guys are in very difficult positions. It's quite clear, as you say, that they understand that this is not working, or at least it's not working in a fast enough time frame to really keep the United States and the American people safe from another attack. But there's really limits to what they can do if they've got a White House that is determined simply to try and contain ISIS, to get through another year, to hand this off to their successor. There's not much that they can do, unfortunately.
We're a few minutes away from hearing from the president, but one of the things he has argued is, and I'm paraphrasing from a statement about a year ago, don't make a bigger deal out of ISIS than is warranted. Yes, they do have some headline grabbing and network news grabbing headlines at attention, attacks that sort of grip us. But by and large, they're not this huge force that threatens global security. What do you say to that?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's completely out of tune with where the American people are, of course. The president seems to be acting more...
What he's saying is you're fearing and giving too much attention to aberrant attacks, scary attacks, but for me to respond with a huge military operation or whatever is not warranted and only feeds the beast or feeds what they want to see.
Yeah, I just don't buy it. I mean, these guys have only got to be right one time, one Paris attack here in the United States,
Right.
Neil, and the country has changed forever. Our freedom, our free society is really changed forever and alterably. So I think you've got to be vigilant. The country is looking not for hysteria, but for a commander-in-chief who's able to convey a sense that he's on top of this, he's going to defeat these guys, and he's got a coherent strategy that makes sense. And this is his highest priority, and he's going to get this done before he leaves office. He's not about handing this off to his successor and just getting out of town without another terrorist attack on his watch.
Well, I get the feeling, to your point, I think it's a brilliant point, that he came into office promising to sort of extract us from this region. And the irony is now he is in the position of potentially getting us more involved in this region than he ever wanted to. But he hopes in the next year or so to sort of run out the clock. I mean, a lot of people get this sense that he'd rather not get re-engaged in this area, certainly not with a large number of troops. He has growing doubts about our so-called allies in the region, growing concern about the Turks and what they're doing. Do you feel partly he's justified there, particularly with looking at allies and those we consider friendly, that oftentimes they're not? So maybe that isn't the answer.
Yeah, no, listen, there's no question that the Middle East has never been a place where you go in search of gratification and satisfaction. It is unbelievably frustrating.
Then what does he have to do to you, John? A lot of people always say, given the vagaries of alliances and the shifting friendships we have there, it is going to be up to America, boots on the ground, and there's no way around it. Lindsey Graham is saying at a minimum 10,000, ideally 20,000. You know the drill. You've heard some of the candidates on this, what the president said in this. But we can't rely on so-called friendly neighbors in the region to do anything, because they don't.
Yeah, I don't buy that. I buy the point about American leadership. But I think you've got to harken back 25 years to the first Gulf War and putting that American foot forward, that we're going to lead this, but we're not going to do it alone. I think you do actually mobilize the rest of the world behind you. That's what I'd like the president to do. It's what President George W. Bush did in 2006 at the darkest days of the Iraq War. He said, my strategy's not working. I've tasked my generals to go back to the drawing board, produce a military plan that's going to defeat these guys in fairly short order. And that's what he did at great political risk. I'd like to hear our president say the same thing, that he's given these guys 2 weeks, producing the military plan before the end of the year to defeat ISIS, and then he's going to take this to the Congress, to NATO, and to our allies in the Middle East to mobilize them behind this strategy and win this war.
You know, I'd forgotten the historic significance of what you just said, John, that you're right. President Bush had said, look, my strategy before the troop surge, it's not working. I've got to pivot here big time, and he did. But he did acknowledge that it wasn't working what he was doing. And I'm thinking way back to Abraham Lincoln, when he went through generals like tissue paper, and he finally found one who could do the job and get it done. But both presidents acknowledged mistakes that were made and that it wasn't working. I could go later on to John Kennedy at the time of the Bay of Pigs. He could have blamed that on his predecessor and the brightest military mind, saying that was the way to go. And he didn't. But now he has an opportunity to redo things. This whole speech is a sort of a redo from his address to the White House 8 days ago. And for those of you tuning in, that's in the Pentagon, the briefing room. The president is expected to be up there very, very shortly to spell out that. Do you think he acknowledges, look, I didn't really outline this sharply, clearly, forcefully enough. Here's point by point what I'm going to do. What do you think?
Yeah, my guess is that he changes around the kind of presentation he gave a week ago, and that he does provide us with a little more detail about what he's both doing to fight ISIS abroad and to keep us safe here at home. Unfortunately, and I hope I'm wrong here, Neil, but I don't expect any major changes in the strategy itself.
Well, John, you've never been wrong on this show, so I don't think that's an issue. But let me ask you something. I was just on the National Security Council. I guess it's grown over the years, but it includes a number of top economic people: the Treasury Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, Deputy Director of Economic Intelligence, and on the rest, the Terrorism Task Force that reports to the Secretary of Treasury. A lot of economic types. That's the type. Those are the types that are going after and tracking down where this black oil that's on the market that ISIS depends on, who's buying it, more to the point, and how forcefully they can stop that. That's a key part of this, isn't it?
It's a huge part of it, shutting down the financing. This is now the most powerful terrorist organization in the history of the world, not only in terms of manpower and land, but in terms of economic wherewithal and revenues, whether it's smuggling of oil and antiquities, whether it's taxing a population of several hundred million people, control of the banking system inside of Iraq and Syria. That's the stuff that our economic warfare
Well, they now have a government, right? They have a finance minister, a banking minister. They have everything but a rewards. They have everything but a rewards card. But the fact of the matter is they've got a system in place. What I'd like to ask you is, what are we going to do if we find out some of our friends and allies, let's say the Turks, a NATO member, are buying that cheap oil or delivering it to those other players in Europe who might need it? Then what do we do?
Listen, it's not a question of if we find out. We know that this is going on, Neil. We know we've got imperfect allies.
Well, do you let the world know that, John? In other words, you say, look, we need Turkey, but truth be told, they've not exactly been on the up and up with us. That makes us look like we're agreeing with Vladimir Putin. A lot of things we're juggling, right?
Yeah, no, you are dealing with a lot, particularly because of this Russian-Turkish angle now and the whole NATO question. You don't want to be looking like you're publicly undermining and humiliating a NATO ally. At the same time, you really do need to begin bringing real pressures to bear, and the president can do that. Part of the problem we have here is that we've got a commander-in-chief who really doesn't seem all that engaged. It looks like climate change or gun control or closing Guantanamo are all higher priorities for him than setting aside the rest of his presidency to defeat this enemy that not only is threatening us and our allies in the Middle East and in Europe now, but here in the homeland. That's the kind of message he's got to convey. And if he brings that kind of priority to this process, it has a real effect on our allies if they think the president is now the desk officer for this war who's going to be after them constantly, week after week.
You know, John, how do these things go? This is running now a few minutes late. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. But you're often told that other military commanders will be very blunt with their commander behind closed doors, as were those who were sitting down with President Kennedy at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and others. And then they will have a united face when it comes to meeting either the press or any public statements at all. How frank are you allowed to be in those venues? How willing is the commander-in-chief, any commander-in-chief, willing to take on criticism from his military guys?
I think they're willing to do it, Neil, if they feel that it's welcome. The problem in this administration is I think the Pentagon and a lot of these military and intelligence advisors have become so battered by the process of the last 7 years. They know that this message of continuing to be on the offense against al-Qaeda and ISIS and the terrorist threat is not something that the White House really welcomes. They really, as you've said, want to get out of this process. They want to disengage from this region. They don't want to hear that they've actually got to get deeper involved if they want to stop these threats from coming to our shores. And I think that's a real problem, and it's an inhibitor to our military. And we've seen it now in this scandal that we have at intelligence, at defense intelligence out of CENTCOM, where commanders are actually now altering the intelligence that's coming up and painting a rosier picture about the war against ISIS than is actually warranted by the facts on the ground.
Amazing. John, great job. Thank you very much for your insight. I know I learned a lot. I think it's fair to say our viewers did. John Hanna, the former National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney.